has provided an introduction there for a lot of the things we will be saying later. So I now call upon Olivier Jacquet, who is seated over there somewhere. Olivier Jacquet, doctor in contemporary history and a researcher. Sorry, I've forgotten what I was saying. A research engineer at the UNESCO Wine and Vine Cultures and Traditions Chair of UNESCO. And there was a drawing there which I missed, which was up a little too, which was shown a little too quickly. Perhaps it can be put up again. Wine without culture, it tastes like it was made by artificial intelligence. So that brings us now to Olivier Jacquet. Thank you very much. If I have the pointer. Okay. I'm not going to talk about artificial intelligence myself. I'm going to talk about history. But his AI will soon be part of that history anyway. So, wine, crises, and resilience. So the idea that was just described by Pascaline, which was mentioned by John Baker, the idea is that we're in a period of great challenges, of crisis for some, and of attempts to resolve the problems of crisis of the economy. So all that has already been explained very well. And the idea here was to show how this isn't the first time we've been facing these sort of challenges, and that the sector has been facing major issues. The sector has been facing this sort of challenge at least since the 19th century, very big issues, and it has always managed to be resilient, to innovate, and to rebuild. So these crises came from different origins. I'll try to give you a quick overview of these different crises over the years and how the sector has always managed to overcome them. It'll be difficult to fit it into that time, but we'll make an effort. So it all began with phylloxera. So phylloxera, as you know, was a little insect that destroyed the French vineyards. It came from the US. And which caused various crises over a very long period of time. Health crises, destruction of the vineyards. You see here the curve of the destruction of the vineyards, which didn't actually stop when they found a solution to phylloxera in the 1880s. In fact, it continued and continued through to the 1920s or 30s. So it was a crisis which led to unfair competition and to fraud. It was a crisis of overproduction, ultimately, and also there was a crisis caused by falling prices. So phylloxera, the problem of phylloxera had to be resolved, and to resolve that, and this, I would say, is the common theme of this presentation, is the idea that the sector has always systematically managed to join together, to join forces to find solutions. Here, talking about the sector in its broader sense, the sector including the sciences and the public authorities, and this was particularly the case under the Third Republic in France. And when phylloxera arrived, they had to find solutions. So they brought in ampelographers, like Alexis Viarte, who was a professor at the University of Bordeaux, Jules-Émile Planchon, Gaston Bazille. Gaston Bazille was from the Hérault region in the south of France, a wine grower and a trader. Jules-Émile Planchon was an entomologist, and all these people managed to find solutions together to combat phylloxera, scientific solutions. There was, at the same time, support from the state and from the wine-growing sector. They didn't work alone. They worked with the nurserymen. They worked with the vine growers who learned how to graft the vines. They also responded to a call from the state offering a prize for resolving, a huge prize for resolving the phylloxera problem, and they came up with the most practical solution, which was uprooting the vines and replanting the vines on US rootstock that was resistant to phylloxera. And this is the whole interest of this. This was the first time that the sciences were joining forces in a multidisciplinary way and internationally to fight against the crisis. It reminds us a little bit of what happened during COVID. ultimately, because it was a sort of COVID crisis of vines. With the scientists, if the scientists, the public authorities and the sector hadn't addressed this, the vineyards might have disappeared altogether by now. So this was a major crisis which was resolved by grafting. But this crisis then led to problems of fraud. And the idea here is to show that there was decline in wine production from 1863 through to the 1920s or 30s, and yet there was a rise, an average rise in production. The average rise in production was due to changes in techniques, replanting the vines in rows to have higher yields, the arrival of fertilizers in the vineyards, also caused by phylloxera, better vine-growing techniques, and also what was later called fraud. Why was there more wine when there was less, when there were fewer grapes? Half of the vineyards had disappeared in the space of 50 or 60 years. Why was there more wine? It's quite simply because they saw the arrival of unfair competition. Some of the wine makers of the time were using all sorts of different things instead of grapes to provide the population with wine at a time when average per capita consumption was 130 litres a year at the time. And so they needed to fight against this fraud in the production of wine with all sorts of different products. So this fraud spread in the as there was a shortage of grapes. And this fraud in winemaking produced artificial wines. And then there was a second fraud which was developed, which was regarding the appellations of the wines, the labels of the wine. There were traders who would bring in grapes to make Burgundy wines, but they would get the grape in the Rhone Valley, or they'd make Bordeaux wine with grapes from Spain, or due to the shortage of local grapes, they would get grapes wherever they could to make their wine. But at a time when in the French regions they were replanting the vines, which was a huge sacrifice for the wine growers, they weren't managing to sell their wine to local traders because the markets had turned elsewhere, which destabilized the market. And this was caused directly by phylloxera. So how did they overcome this? First of all, through a collective effort. In 1884, there were the first wine growing unions, the first in Saint-Émilion. And these syndicats or unions was to combat disease, to achieve progress in wine growing, to redevelop the vineyards, to buy equipment together, because they were now replanting the vines in rows, and they had to buy wires, they had to buy stakes for the planting, also to examine economic and legislative measures in the interest of wine growing, and to ensure that there was political support. And this is where the Third Republic came along and provided support in the wine-growing regions for the initiatives of the wine growers and traders. And there were a number of laws were passed against fraud because there was this collective mobilization, which probably is quite unique in the history of wine growing. So this fight against fraud also saw the emergence of new sciences and the emergence of enology, especially which began with Pasteur or perhaps Chaptal. But the enologists provided support for the markets and played a full role in the sector by analyzing the products to see whether they were fraudulent or not, to make sure that any transactions were fair, and also to innovate, to train, and to provide expertise and analysis to respond to the growing demand for quality and to eliminate the fraudulent wines. In the 1890s, 4 million hectoliters of wine were sold that had been made with raisins. And this enology became a part of the vine and wine growing economy. with the agronomy stations in Bordeaux and in Dijon, and in all the wine regions. There was one in Cognac as well, all over the country, and these provided support for the wine growers. Another big issue at the time was fraud on the appellations or the origins of the wine. The initial legislation sought to define the wine regions administratively. Some of these were defined very early, in 1908 in Champagne, Cognac, then Banyuls in 1919, the Clairette de Die in 1910, and Bordeaux in 1911. So these administrative appellations in the end stopped because, in fact, they weren't really based on reality. They were determined by the local authorities or by the prefects rather than by the wine growers. And it was, in fact, each time, in fact, here also, again, it was the wine sector which stepped in. And to allow this, the government of the Third Republic proposed a law with the support of the wine-growing organizations around the country and a new union, the Federation of Wine-Growing Associations of France. And the idea was to fight against these false appellations by creating a law which would make it possible to create appellations of origin by judgment. This is the law of the 6th of May 1990, which emphasized the idea that a wine must have a precise origin. This was something quite new in the 19th century, and this was how the markets had been destabilized. It was a very free market. The traders were the main winemakers at the time, and if they wanted, they could, in fact, bring in grapes from elsewhere because the notion of origin was very vague. And, of course, they did this during phylloxera. At least some of them did because they didn't have the choice. They didn't have the grapes, but this destabilized the markets. And so, ultimately, these appellations were based on origin rather than on the quality of the wine, and you will see later that this is important.
This is important. It's slightly underappreciated, but they started with 100 appellations in France, about 40 in Bordeaux, lots of big names, and also in Burgundy, in Auvergne, Armagnac, Cahors, Gagnac, Puy-Fumé, Alsace, a bunch of the appellations that were formed at this time. And that would shape the future of the French winemaking industry around the idea of origin. So suddenly, origin becomes because frankly, it wasn't really very clearly defined. It certainly wasn't compulsory in the past. The problem with this law, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but there are a certain number of problems with this initial legislation. It creates quite a lot of conflict in French wine regions because a lot of the courts get involved. And particularly, the idea of what constitutes quality was not really well defined in the technical specifications. So you have to define the origin of the reasons, you have to define what grape varieties could be planted shortly afterwards. But in terms of actual quality, the wines that are being produced in appellations of origin, where they were not necessarily high-quality wines. But this 30th of July 1935, this was, again, this is a decree which didn't come right from the top. It's not a top-down. There were really grassroots movements by professionals in the wine sector who were lobbying their elected officials, their members of parliament, with support from science and the economic and ecological sectors to have this new system. So there are new, finally, this is 1935, get new quality restrictions. You have to have a minimum alcohol content, and there are appellations which will now be controlled henceforth by a new institution. The INO is the National Institution for Appellations of Origin, the INAO. And previously, we had 186 appellations, AOCs, founded in the 1930s and 40s. But the crisis continued nonetheless. This was a long crisis. I hope the current crisis isn't going to drag on for quite so long. But particularly in the 1920s and 30s, there were tough times for French winemaking. There was a global glut, there's overproduction worldwide, and the French markets were really struggling. International markets were closing up. It might be a little bit reminiscent of what's going on. The American market was closing up. Prohibition was raging. There was a lot of competition internally because there was some very high production of wine region. Particularly, a lot of wine was being made in Algeria with some Of course, they were being used by unscrupulous wine growers in France to pass it off as their own wines, and there was a lot of controls, and also a lot of fraud. There was also a lot of tax. The tax barrier was 90% tariffs to export wine to Scandinavia, for example, in the 1930s. That's another problem. The sector was also changing and evolving, and that was interesting. And there was a certain degree of differentiation which was emerging. Wine merchants were no longer the only ones blending and bottling wines. Wines were increasingly being bottled on the domain, at the estate or the chateau. You know, Chateau Margaux was in 1924. 1924 was the first time Margaux bottled the wines at the chateau. Similar in Burgundy, the first time they were being bottled either at the estate or by cooperative wineries, which were emerging in this period, and also during this period. And again, this is goes back to the idea that wine should have a broader culture behind it. We start to see a real new discourse about the importance of tradition, rediscovering, reinventing in some cases, traditions, the idea of the terroir, really imbuing wine with that cultural dimension, a cultural dimension which you can find here, for example, illustrated with the first time we had the first wine festivals. This was in Quinconce, the Place de Quinconce here in Bordeaux, just before the First World War, just when they were starting to carve up Bordeaux's wine region into administrative entities, because there's a crisis going on, a crisis in the wine industry. So what was the response to that crisis? It was about creating a new approach, a new discourse, which could rally the whole wine sector around a more positive image of wine and its industry. And there are other initiatives between the wars in Burgundy, for example, with the rediscovery of the folklore that goes around wine, the Paulet, you may know the Paulet, which was created in 1923. And of course, the first great brotherhood, the Brotherhood of Wine, for the Chevalier de Tutelle of Wine, which created in 1934. Not a coincidence, just when Prohibition was coming to an end in America, and it was a way of selling that folkloric image to the Americans and to promote that new discourse of what wine means, what it means to the terroir, its history, its territory, the authenticity of wines, new sales arguments for the re-emerging American markets. Another major initiative from the interwar years was the foundations were laid, and Mr. Parker mentioned this earlier, it was the foundation of the OIV. This is an interesting letter. It's from 1923. It's a letter from Raymond Poincaré, President of the Council, sent it to the French ambassador in London, which moots the idea for the first of the OIV. Now, the OIV wasn't created just yet, but here's the idea. It's the idea of finding new ways to coordinate our efforts to develop external, international markets for wine, to take measures to promote the reputation and the health benefits of wine, and unify and harmonize regulations. It's important to fight against fraud, naturally, and to create an international office for wine, which would be responsible for implementing all these measures and promoting wine. We're already talking in 1923 about creating a wine route, potentially a wine museum. Of course, the Second World War comes. I know I'm going fast here. I hope you're keeping up. Wave your hand if I'm going too fast. The Second World War, another crisis, just starting to get out of the overproduction crisis in the 1930s, and then along comes a world war. You've got some Nazis here. This is Christophe Legrand wrote an interesting book about the Nazis, what they did in France. They came and bought up a load of wine from France because the Deutschmark was so strong. They didn't actually rob all the wine. They did actually pay for it, but there was still production problems. There was a lack of wine from 1942 because they drunk up. Basically, the Germans drunk it all. And so there's a lot of fraud, a lot of appellations producing very low-quality wines. But the war also saw the unofficial birth of the first winemaking classifications. In addition to appellation, of course, you have the 1855 classification here in Bordeaux, but I'm talking about the hierarchies within appellations. So, for example, in Burgundy, this is when you get the Premier Cru, created in around 1943. You get that first categorization hierarchy of Burgundy crus. And around the world also. You're starting to see wines being more and more produced in California, Australia, South America, and the volumes produced. The OIV actually recently produced some figures on that. You can see a real reshaping, reconfiguration of the global wine market. In France, during that time, we still have the appellation system, but after the war, with fraud still being such a problem, you have consumers who are no longer really trusting the AOC system because again, they put their trust in merchants, in wine brands. And so some of the wine brands, the wine merchants, managed to adapt to the appellation system. Others continued to put their faith in their wine brands. So consumers continued to put their trust in the brands that they knew and trusted. Still not entirely won over by the concept of origin, because it's still relatively new and not yet a guarantee of quality. And also they're not quite sure about the idea of terroir. The idea of tasting a terroir is a kind of pejorative, sort of rustic, sort of peasanty sort of thing to drink local terroir wines. It's not until the 1970s that it becomes really a positive thing, the idea that a wine tastes of the terroir where it comes from. You see, the consumption of wine, AOC, designated geographical origin wines, were only accounting for about 12% of wine during that time. But one crisis always comes with opportunities, and this is another example. This is the historian Joseph Boiling has really retraced the alliance between the health lobby, the anti-alcohol lobby, and the INEO, that's the French appellation of origin system. They became allies. That's right. That's the people responsible for promoting appellation wines. But they're doing that to promote wines which are from designated origins at the expense of everyday cheap wine. The idea is that people should be drinking less wine but better wine, and hence they begin championing the appellation of origin system at European level. And the way out of the crisis, and it's very fine in the 1980s, the 1990s, the years 2000, France's appellation wines, these designated geographical origin wines, explode in popularity around the world, because the industry has decided to create this infrastructure to make that possible. The Technical Institute of Wine for promoting and improving the quality of wines. Remember that there were wine growers who used to start vinifying the wines, fermenting wines at the estate for the first time, and they had everything to learn. But that has obviously come along with it. There are also a lot of accreditation. It's 1974 that wines had to be tasted before they could actually put AOC on the label. They had to pass the taste test. That wasn't until the 1970s. In Bordeaux, that became very popular very quickly, but it wasn't compulsory for a long time. A lot of winemaking syndicates finally got on board and said, okay, we do need to taste the wines before we bottle them. The problem, when you have to be accredited, is that people need to know how to taste wines. So if you used to taste with the terms that used to be used in the 18th and the 19th centuries, the terms were really just all about the mouthfeel. Bear in mind that they used to taste with a little cup, a little. So you can actually feel the line. They weren't using proper glasses. In terms of aromas, describing aromas, the lexicon, the vocabulary of wine tasters was really poor. One of the big breakthroughs that was made by the winemaking sector broadly was the creation of a new vocabulary, a new lexicon, which allows to really to describe appellation wines, in creating terms which these days you get impression. Typicity is a very important French word. Typicity. Remember, the first law against appellations, which had nothing about quality in it, was just about origins. Typicity has to communicate the idea, this cultural idea, that the origin of a wine is implicitly connected to its quality. The origin is important. You can see that a lot of efforts were made in Burgundy, in the southern Burgundy and Beaujolais, particularly by a gentleman called Jules Chauvet, who was really a pioneer of the aromatic approach to wine testing, which has since spread around the world. And I'll finish with this little slide. It's an interesting, it's a sketch from history, which is shows how in reality this has happened. Is that every time you had to fight against a crisis, there were three pillars. There's a technical and scientific aspect. Technical and scientific, the production side of wine producers, but let's not forget the importance of politics, the political sphere, and they played an important role in changing things. And here is this is a French play on words, because a bribe in French is called a pot de vin, a pot of wine. So one way out of the crisis, why don't we make all the bribes payable in actual wine from now on? And it's a joke from the French wine magazine, the Revue de France in the 1930s. But you look at the bottles in front of them on the table here. You might not be able to read them, but you've got the first one says Bar Leroy. That means Baron Leroy. That was the president of the Grand Cru Association, a former OIV section, president of the INAO. These are winemakers who are also elected officials lobbying for the creation of the appellations. You can even see at the bottom of the screen there, the chateau they're drinking is a Chateau Forcia, which is an estate owned by Baron Leroy. Little references. So that Baron Leroy really, in that way, embodies some of the collective spirit which presided at the birth of the INEO and the way out of those crises of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Thank you very much.